keep joining in. So hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure being here today for the fourth and closing lecture of the spring semester lecture series at the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies. Please note that the session and the following discussion are being recorded. We will upload the recording to our different social media pages, where you will also find all of the forum's past talks. I'm excited to present Professor Johnathan Conant of Brown University. Professor Conant specializes in the late ancient and early medieval Mediterranean, including Vandal, Moorish, and Byzantine North Africa, Muslim-Christian interaction, the North African Jewish community, documentary practice, saints cult, and sectarian violence. Professor Conant is the recipient of the Charles A. Riskamp Research Fellowship, the American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship in 2014, the Junior Fellowship in Byzantine Studies of Dumbarton Oaks in 2002-2003, and the Andrew Haskell Postdoctoral Rome Prize by the American Academy in Rome in 2009-2010. He's affiliated with the American Historical Association, the Medieval Academy of America, and the American Academy in Rome. Professor Conant's book, Staying Roman, Conquest and Identity in Africa and the Mediterranean, 439-700, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2012, and I will also mention the forthcoming publication, North Africa under Byzantium and Early Islam, Kirka 500 till Kirka 800, volume co-edited with Susan T. Stevens, which will come out with Dumbarton Oaks. Today, Professor Conant will speak to us about bishops and the liberation of Roman captives in the 5th century. We will have time for discussion after the talk, so if you have a question for Professor Conant, please send me a message with your name, and I'll ask you to present your question. And now, Professor Conant, thank you for agreeing to be here. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Moore. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to you and everyone for the kind invitation to speak to you. I'm going to warn you, well, two things. One, in the weirdly intimate world of Zoom and the pandemic, it turns out that we're having some plumbing work done today. It's a bit of an emergency, and it couldn't be delayed. So you're going to hear a lot of noise in the background, and at some point I'm probably going to need to get up and say something to the guy who's doing the work for us. So I apologize for that in advance. And the second thing is that this is a project that I've been working on for way too long. So some of you have heard earlier versions of this talk in other fora, and so I'm just going to apologize for duplicating things, for saying things again that you've already heard. All right. Liberating captives, as every scholar of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages knows, was one of the many virtues of a good bishop. William Klingshirn published the seminal article in 1985, and he focused specifically on the case of the 6th century bishop Caesarius of Arles. The redemption of captives, Klingshirn argues, allowed Caesarius to establish both his patronage over those whom he liberated and also to establish a wider reputation for holiness. And this, in turn, allowed Caesarius's efforts to defend the disputed boundaries of his ecclesiastical province, to convert adherents of traditional cult to Christianity, and to establish political ties both with the Ostrogothic king Theodoric and with the Roman bishop Symmachus. It's a brilliant article. Its interpretations still hold up nearly 40 years on, and it's not my intention to challenge it here today, except in one small, but I think important point. The redemption of those who fell into captivity through warfare, brigandage, and piracy had a long and textured history in the ancient Mediterranean, stretching back hundreds of years before the emergence of Christianity in the Greek, Roman, and Jewish traditions. Early Christians were also encouraged to give money for the purpose of ransoming their captive co-religionists. And so, like most scholars who've worked on the topic before and since, Klingshirn accepts that, and this is a quotation, by the 5th century, there had long been common agreement that the ransoming of captives was one of the bishop's foremost responsibilities. But I think close attention to the chronology of the sources suggests that this isn't really the case. Quite the contrary. In Christian hagiography, episcopal involvement in the liberation of captives only began to be seen as praiseworthy in the beginning of the 5th century. Above all, I argue, under the influence of the 4th century bishop Ambrose of Milan. Recognizing this fact allows us to read other contemporary sources, including not just hagiography, but also episcopal letters, homiletic and exegetical literature, laws, and even histories with fresh eyes, and to tell a different story about when and how bishops became embroiled in the liberation of captives. Acknowledging the novelty of bishops' concern for freeing enslaved Christians also allows us to appreciate with greater clarity the extent to which episcopal practice was shaped in the late 4th and 5th centuries by the expectations of ordinary inhabitants of the Roman Empire, how it was both a top-down and a bottom-up process, and also why bishops could sometimes be reluctant to act to liberate captives. Pulling all of this together, what I'm going to try to prove to you over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is that in the last decades of the 4th century, Ambrose radicalized episcopal practices of captive liberation, formulating a new model of episcopal piety that was gradually emulated elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. I'm going to try to convince you that in the face of otherwise uncertain options, this new model sent a powerful signal to ordinary Romans about the commitment of individual bishops to the redemption of the enslaved, and that out of the resulting dialogic relationship between episcopal ideology on the one hand and a widespread social concern for those carried off into captivity on the other hand, that the role of bishop as liberator broadened into a routine expectation of the office only over the course of the 5th and 6th century. And I tried to do that in 2 parts. The first part focused on episcopal ideology and Ambrose's radicalization of episcopal practice. And then the second part focused on the role of ordinary Romans. So part 1, when did bishops begin to involve themselves with captives? Shortly after assuming the episcopacy in the context of the Roman Gothic conflict of 376 to 382, Ambrose of Milan engaged in a dramatic and controversial ransoming of war captives. The incident is known exclusively through Ambrose's later defense of it in his De Officiis, and while the event can be reconstructed in its bold outlines, the details are unfortunately elusive. The bishop refers to the devastation of Illyricum and Thrace as the result of which captive provincials were sold all over the world, toto orbe. While some of them may well have been trafficked to slave owners in his own see, the provincial captives whom Ambrose liberated were thus probably not citizens of Milan, but they were rather imperial subjects from the Balkans. Now, freeing enslaved Christians from a distant province was not in itself contentious in the late 4th century. Rather, the controversy over Ambrose's actions centered on how he went about doing this task. The most serious criticism leveled against Ambrose was that in order to ransom enslaved provincials, he didn't raise a collection from his own congregation or reallocate income from his church's estates or even sell off some of its landed property. Instead, he chose to destroy liturgical vessels, confringere vasa mystica, probably gifts from the emperor Constantius II to Ambrose's Homoian predecessor, Auxentius. Now, a lot of scholarly attention has focused on this aspect of Ambrose's practice, and rightly so, because the liquidation of church property was a risky move in the late 4th century. In fact, in 357, similar circumstances had provided a justification for the brief deposition of Cyril of Jerusalem. Cyril had sought to raise funds to alleviate a local food scarcity by selling off some of his church's liturgical vessels and vestments, only to have a robe that had been presented to the church by no less a figure than the Emperor Constantine show up in the costume of a local stage dancer. As Cyril learned, selling or melting down a church's sacred furnishings risked angering its powerful patrons and their heirs or partisans. And similarly, Ambrose's later destruction of liturgical ornaments to free captives upset the Arians, presumably including Ambrose's own clergy, many of whom at this point would still have been appointees of his predecessor Auxentius, and therefore presumably Homoian. In fact, as Neil McLinn has argued, this was probably part of the point. Ambrose's dramatic abergetic act provided him with an opportunity to begin dismantling the sectarian legacy of Auxentius and Constantius. So it's hardly surprising that while the piety of Ambrose's liberation of captives was widely acknowledged, the bishop found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend himself against accusations of high-handedness and misappropriation of ecclesiastical property. In fact, there's a delicious ambiguity in the terse acknowledgement of his biographer, the Milanese deacon Paulinus, that Ambrose had been excessively, or nimium, concerned about captives. And though Paulinus probably intended this to be complimentary, the remark scarcely amounts to a resounding endorsement of Ambrose's practice, especially given the fact that it's Paulinus's only comment on the subject. Less attention has been paid to the way in which Ambrose's actions fundamentally reconfigured the role of Christian bishops in liberating captives. Before the late 4th century, bishops seem largely to have limited themselves to exhorting their congregants to give money to free the enslaved. The overall emphasis, though, was on the piety of individual Christians, not on that of the bishop. Charitable giving of this sort had been encouraged by the 3rd century Syrian Didascalia, and it's reiterated in the later apostolic constitutions, but early practice is most clearly illustrated in a well-known letter by the mid-3rd century Bishop Cyprian of Carthage. In response to a request from some episcopal colleagues in the North African borderlands, Cyprian quickly gathered together 100,000 sesterces in alms from the people of his clergy, from the people and clergy, rather, of his city, to help underwrite the ransoming of Christian captives. He sent along the cash together with the names of each individual who had contributed and a request to his colleagues that they remember these numerous small donors in their prayers. In Cyprian's day, then, bishops acted mainly as brokers and mediators for their congregations. Ambrose, by contrast, set himself up as a charismatic individual liberator, acting, as far as we know, without the supportive contributions from his flock, in the face of resistance on the part of his own clergy, and in defiance of well-established social customs regarding the treatment of high-profile, valuable, and sacralized gifts to the church. Far from being sanctioned by deep tradition, then, Ambrose's actions in the later 370s or early 380s were critical to the emergence of a new model of episcopal piety, which centered on the figure of the bishop liberator. This model only took root in Mediterranean Christianity over the course of the late 4th and 5th centuries. Significantly, early Christian biographical works in Greek and Latin do not praise bishops for liberating captives. From about the year 400 onward, though, this praise becomes increasingly common, particularly in the West. In his early 5th century dialogues, for example, Sulpicius Severus wrote that Martin of Tours had received a gift of 100 pounds of silver sometime after the year 385, which he entirely dedicated to the redemption of captives. After the death of Paulinus of Nola in 431, the bishops in Comias, the priest Uranius, similarly infused. How many captives did he redeem? At about the same time, Augustine's biographer, Placidius of Calama, claimed that the Bishop of Hippo explicitly modeled himself on Ambrose, ordering that sacred vessels from his church also be melted down and sold, and that the proceeds be used to ransom captives. A decade later, the Eastern lawyer and church historian Sozomen related that during John Chrysostom's exile of 404 to 407, that bishop's supporters had provided him with enough funds that he was able to buy the freedom of captives seized by Isaurian bandits and to return them to their families. And most dramatically of all, Sozomen's contemporary Socrates of Constantinople recounted that after the conclusion of the Roman-Persian War of 421 to 422, the Mesopotamian bishop Acacius of Amida sold liturgical ornaments to redeem 7,000 Persian prisoners of war and to ensure that they were safely returned to their country. In the 420s, the liberation of non-Romans in this way was unusual enough to cause a stir, but 3 generations later, in the 480s, the use of ecclesiastical treasure to redeem captives was well on its way to becoming a routine element in the praise of pious bishops, at least in the West. Within 2 to 3 generations, ransoms of this sort were validated under Roman law as the only legitimate reason for the alienation of church vessels' investments. Not all bishops were as explicit as Augustine in modeling themselves on Ambrose's example, and the earliest bishop liberators in particular may well have been improvising and innovating within the Christian and Mediterranean evergetic tradition independently of, but in similar ways to, the Bishop of Milan. But it would still be rash to dismiss the possibility of Ambrose's influence out of hand. It's conceivable that directly or indirectly, his actions inspired all of those other early bishops who were praised for their work freeing captives. Like Augustine, for example, Paulinus of Nola claimed Ambrose as a spiritual father. Given that the captives Ambrose liberated were from Thrace and Illyricum, it also seems plausible that news of his actions might have reached nearby Constantinople fairly quickly, potentially shaping local Christian expectations of episcopal behavior in the generation before the deposition and exile of John Chrysostom. Martin, too, may have quickly heard of Ambrose's liberation of captives. And if so, it seems possible that in 385 specifically, the actions of his Milanese colleague might well have been on the mind of the ascetic Bishop of Tours. In that year, both Martin and Ambrose had dealings with the court of the Gallic usurper Maximus at Trier, where the charismatic ascetic Priscillian of Avila had just been put to death as a sorcerer and a manichae. Neither Ambrose nor Martin had supported Priscillian during his lifetime, but both were outraged that their episcopal colleagues at Maximus's court had pursued a case against a fellow bishop ruthlessly enough that it led to his execution. And Ambrose and Martin each independently visited Trier shortly after Priscillian's death, and both initially refused to share communion with the responsible parties. Ambrose held his ground and was expelled from the court. Martin, by contrast, relented as part of a deal with Maximus that ensured the emperor's support for some politically sensitive petitions and scuppered his plans to proscribe more heretics. Martin's reputation was tarnished as a result of his equivocation, and Sulpicius Severus frames the bishop's sudden and dramatic commitment to liberating captives as one of a series of proofs that he had regained the grace that he had lost at Trier. It's not inconceivable then that Ambrose was very much in Martin's thoughts as he sought to find a path through the tangled thicket of spiritual politics in which he found himself. In any case, Martin's experience highlights another important aspect of the episcopal liberation of captives in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. For all that it was undoubtedly also an act of compassion and piety, freeing the enslaved helped bishops solve particularly thorny reputational problems. For Martin, this was the damage done to his standing in Gaul by communicating with Priscillian's persecutors. For John Chrysostom, it was the challenge of rehabilitating his social and spiritual status after his deposition and exile. For Augustine, as for Ambrose, it was probably the urgency of establishing his authority within a highly charged sectarian atmosphere. For Acacius, it was the threat posed by mutual resentment and hostility in the wake of the Roman-Persian War of 421 to 422. Before the war, Acacius had been working under the auspices of Theodosius II and the Persian Shahanshah Yazdegerd I to build an alliance between Christians and the Roman and Persian empires. The hostility to this effort on the part of Yazdegerd's successor, Bahram V, and the ensuing flare-up of hostilities with Theodosius threatened to collapse the distinction between Christianity and Romanness within the Roman Empire. For Acacius, then, the liberation of Persian prisoners was not just a dramatic act of piety performed within an emerging episcopal tradition, it was also an attempt to solve a problem of existential importance to his alliance-building efforts by establishing his own credibility and good faith with an unsympathetic imperial court. So in short, the centrality of liberating captives to episcopal models of piety was not a timeless inheritance from the early Christian period. Like other inhabitants of the ancient Mediterranean, Christians did have a long tradition of freeing members of their own community who had fallen into foreign servitude. But in the classical period, actions of this sort principally involved pious giving by ordinary members of the congregation. Bishops collected and distributed the funds, but they didn't receive any special praise for their efforts. In the late 4th century, though, Ambrose of Milan pioneered a new model of redeeming captives, which focused on the figure of the bishop liberator. In its most dramatic form, this model entirely sidestepped the dedicated giving of everyday Christians and instead funded the ransoming of captives through the destruction or sale of liturgical vessels and vestments. This model was picked up and adopted and adapted by Ambrose's contemporaries, Martin of Tours and John Chrysostom, as well as by a new generation of episcopal leaders, including Augustine and Paulinus of Nola over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, and it continued to spread throughout the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. Initially, the model was probably most popular along or near imperial frontiers. In the event, of course, the pressures of invasion and warfare proved to be more intense in the West than in the East, and it's therefore probably no coincidence that the liberation of captives came to be a particularly charismatic feature, a particularly characteristic, also charismatic feature of Western episcopal piety in the 5th and 6th centuries. Which brings us to part 2. What role did ordinary Romans have in all of this? The emergence of the late antique figure of the bishop liberator was never an entirely top-down affair. The sudden efflorescence in the 5th century of hagiographic sources that praise bishops for the care they lavished on captives is good at showing the emergence of this ideology. It's good at showing when and how it spread. It's good at showing what its stakes were from an episcopal perspective. The hagiography is less good at showing the nitty-gritty world of practical captive liberation, and in particular, the role that actors other than bishops played in freeing the enslaved. That world is far better illustrated by a small but significant set of 5th century episcopal letters about Roman citizens who had been seized and enslaved inside the empire, in North Africa, in Syria, and in Gaul. Collectively, what these letters reveal is that their authors' involvement with captives emerged out of a dialogic relationship between bishops and everyday Romans. In other words, even as bishops began to put themselves forward as especially dedicated to the redemption of the enslaved, they also found themselves in the position of having to contend with the assertive actions and heightened expectations of their flocks. The negotiations this inevitably entailed proved equally critical to the formulation of the idea of the bishop as liberator. Reliance on hagiographical sources should not blind us to the fact that it will typically have been the families of the enslaved, not bishops, who worked most actively to ensure the redemption of their kin. Certainly, late antique authors assumed that ransoming captives was an activity that would normally be undertaken by relatives, friends, or neighbors. This was also an assumption borne out in letters written by Augustine and Sidonius Apollinaris to episcopal colleagues about imperial subjects who had been illicitly seized and enslaved inside the territory of the empire. In the 470s and the twilight years of late Roman Gaul, Sidonius wrote to Lupus of Troyes about an unnamed freeborn woman who had been attacked by brigands while traveling, captured, and unbeknownst to the bishop, sold to one of his own negotiatores. Yet Sidonius only learned of these events because the woman's relatives had relentlessly pursued aging clues as to her whereabouts all the way to Clermont and Troyes. And only when they brought the situation to the bishop's attention, did he concern himself with the origins of the woman enslaved in his service. Half a century earlier, in about 428, Augustine had written to Alypius of Tagaste, the primate of Numidia and a childhood friend, about a similar problem, but on a much larger scale. It's a pretty well-known letter. 4 months earlier, Augustine reveals, members of his congregation had used direct action to free 120 North African provincials who had been abducted and held at the port of Hippo for transshipment and sale overseas. Here too, the captives' families came looking for them. Augustine specifically discusses a Numidian peasant girl who had been snatched from her family by slavers in a night raid, and whose brother made the trek all the way to Hippo in order to press for her release. But the bishop also makes clear that family members of the girl's fellow captives likewise descended upon the African port, carrying letters from their local bishops and seeking to redeem their kinsfolk too. To do so was to persevere intrepidly in the face of the cruelest of odds. For a start, directly ransoming a captive was expensive in late antiquity. Even along the imperial frontiers, where large numbers of people were seized in raids and warfare, and where their commodified bodies could be bought cheap, ransoms could run to 8 to 12 gold solidi for Roman captives, common Roman captives. This represented perhaps 1.5 to 2 times what it would cost to keep a family of 4 alive at subsistence levels for an entire year. For captives illicitly enslaved inside the empire, a court case might be cheaper, but it was still a notoriously lengthy and costly process. For a great many families then, the redemption of a captive child, spouse, sibling, or parent from their own resources would not have been a possibility, because they quite simply lacked the means to pursue this remedy for their loss. Moreover, with the notable exception of high-profile figures deliberately ransomed back for great profit by their captives, the chances of redeeming any given individual who had been carried off into slavery were probably pretty low. This was most clearly the case beyond the frontiers of the empire, where captivity was treated as the equivalent of legal as well as social death. But Augustine, at least, was even more pessimistic about illegally enslaved captives' chances of being restored to freedom if they were sold inside the territory of the empire. Many are redeemed from the barbarians, he wrote, but those who are transported to provinces across the sea find no aid of redemption. This was probably not just hyperbole on Augustine's part. After all, the woman purchased by Sidonius's negotiator died in slavery before her family found her. Tales of redemption, by contrast, are rare. In the mid-5th century, Theodoric of Cyrus wrote to a colleague about a young Romano-African aristocrat named Maria, who'd been captured and sold into slavery in Roman Syria in the wake of a misfortune, a symphora, that had befallen her native province. In the end, she was freed, but she was saved by the fact that she'd been accompanied into servitude by one of her enslaved attendants. This anonymous woman had continued to wait on Maria in their common bondage, drawing their new owner's attention to Maria's former status, and eventually arousing the sympathy of the garrison of Cyrus, who raised the money to repay Maria's purchase price and return her to freedom. But this can hardly have been the typical experience of the enslaved, regardless of whether they were carried off by foreigners, brigands, or Roman slave traders. In the face of poor prospects, the relatives of captives drew on every resource that was available to them to secure the liberation of their enslaved kin. Bishops loom large in the surviving sources, but they don't stand entirely alone. As in classical antiquity, relatives, friends, and neighbors of the enslaved might reach out to wealthy patrons for help. Over the course of the 5th century, rich and pious aristocrats like Melania the Younger and many others were praised for charitable giving in this regard. Bishops continued to encourage altruism of this sort at a less exalted level too. And similarly, in 468, the Eastern Emperor Leo I confirmed that the benevolently minded could include provisions for the ransom of captives in their wills. In the early 5th century, the Western Emperor Honorius charged town councils as well as prelates with the task of advocating with provincial administrators on behalf of illegally enslaved captives. The local soldiery could get involved too, as happened in 443 at Asimus, a small fortified town on the Danube frontier, whose military garrison recaptured and freed a number of Roman captives from the Hunnic army as it withdrew from imperial territory. According to the 5th century diplomat and historian Priscus, the city's notables even subsequently rebuffed an imperial directive either to return the liberated captives to the Huns or to pay a ransom for them. The story plays an important role in Priscus's condemnation, or criticism rather, of the regime of the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II, so it can't be taken uncritically. But as mentioned before, something similar is said to have taken place in contemporary Cyrus, where it was the city's garrison and not its bishop that raised the money to secure the aristocratic Maria's release. But the official representatives of the Roman Empire also seem to have been, at best, unreliable protectors. In 409, for example, Theodosius II had to insist that Roman soldiers could not keep as slaves those Romans who had been reduced to bondage by foreigners and then recaptured in imperial military action. Moreover, persistent suggestions of a greater or lesser degree of official complicity in the enslavement of captive Romans run through a striking number of sources. Sidonius insisted that his negotiator had openly purchased the kidnapped woman in Clermont, where the market register still recorded the transaction several years later. In theory, slave markets like this, and like the one where Maria was sold, were supposed to be regulated to prevent the illicit sale of Roman citizens, but these regulations seem not to have been very effective in either of these two cases. In 408, the Western Emperor Honorius even had to instruct his Praetorian prefect not to allow petitioners to enslave Roman refugees from Illyricum who had fled their homes in advance of an impending Gothic invasion, as these petitioners had apparently been seeking to do. The law suggests that the petitioners had access to the highest levels of the imperial administration, where they felt they were likely to meet with a sympathetic ear and maybe even receive official sanction for their activities. 20 years later, Augustine believed that the slave raiders active in the North African countryside similarly had powerful patrons at the imperial court. He also hints darkly that the merchants who plied the illegal trade in enslaved Romans may have been operating with the tacit consent of the imperial authorities along the Mediterranean coast. At precisely this same time, though, bishops like Augustine were carefully cultivating the social conviction that under episcopal oversight, the failure of justice was not inevitable. This belief, together with the fact that some prominent bishops were beginning enthusiastically to embrace a model of piety that focused on the liberation of captives, led the families and advocates of the enslaved to demand action beyond what the prelates themselves might have comfortably envisioned. Strikingly, in each of the specific 5th century cases that Augustine, Theodoret, and Sidonius discuss in their letters, the problem of liberating the enslaved was something that was thrust onto the bishop by other people. Augustine, for example, explicitly disavowed having played any role in the actual freeing of the 120 captives who'd been held in his city. He claimed instead that he'd been away from Hippo at the time and that members of his church had carried out this act on their own. It might be too hasty to see in this assertion nothing more than the aging bishop unheroically seeking to exculpate himself in the face of potential legal troubles. To be sure, the slave merchants' patrons appear to have brought a case against Augustine for his followers' vigilante action. The bishop certainly also appreciated the perils of the situation, and it's probably significant that he shields those who are involved with the dual cloaks of anonymity and multiplicity. But he does at least concede that in this case, the actions of his flock were consonant with his own practice. His congregants had been tipped off by a local Christian who, he said, knew our custom in alms of this sort. More to the point, Augustine's own absence from Hippo finds a parallel in Theodoret's absence from Cyrus. Maria was also freed legally in this case, while Theodoret was away from his city. Thereafter, she seems to have been foisted upon the bishop by the local soldiery in very much the same way that Augustine's followers handed responsibility for the liberated captives over to him. Sidonius, too, involved himself in the plight of the kidnapped woman only when he was confronted by her outraged family. whose intention to pursue legal restitution for the abduction and enslavement of their kinswoman may well originally have focused on the Bishop of Clermont himself. Sidonius pled ignorance on his own behalf and claimed that his agent had been duped, but these protestations had the same rhetorical effect as the putative absences of Augustine and Theodoret, which was less to distance these bishops from their followers' actions than it was to justify inaction on their own parts. So the impetus for the bishops to get involved in untidy affairs like these seems consistently to have come from the social expectations of their flocks or from the aggrieved parties themselves. Instead, in fact, as Augustine himself had once observed in a different context, when the wrongfully enslaved approached a bishop for help, he would be thought unmerciful if he did not devote himself to their care. It's also notable that even bishops ideologically committed to their role as liberators could be cautious, maybe even reluctant, to act when they were confronted with real-world captives. The bishop liberator model worked best when the lines between Christian provincials and their barbarian captors were clear-cut. Cases like those that confronted Augustine in 428 and to a lesser extent Theodoret and Sidonius later in the 5th century were a lot less tidy. In fact, as the work of Kyle Harper and others has recently shown with exceptional clarity, the Roman world had long relied not just on foreign conquest to meet its unquenchable demand for enslaved labor, but also on internal, sometimes unlawful sources that remained an open secret in late antiquity. So, for example, Roman provincials captured in war or in cross-border raids could be sold back into the empire as slaves, perhaps even knowingly purchased by their fellow citizens, a practice against which Maximus of Turin thundered in the early 5th century. In theory, of course, Romans carried off into foreign slavery eventually regained their rights as citizens after their return to Roman territory. But even so, an early 5th century constitution of Honorius confirmed what was by then a venerable practice in the empire, whereby those who had been bought back from foreign captors owed their redeemers either their purchase price or 5 years of labor. Descent into slavery through kidnapping or brigandage was also a persistent anxiety in ancient literature. By late antiquity, well-established social practice allowed destitute parents to sell their freeborn children into servitude. In fact, child sale was so deeply entrenched in Mediterranean society that it confounded persistent attempts by the central imperial administration to safeguard the inalienable liberty of Roman citizens. And later interpreters believed that Roman law legitimated sales of this sort, with the provision, doubtless often fictive, that in time, the return to liberty of the children in question was guaranteed. The free could also sell themselves into slavery, an option that the weight of the evidence suggests was most typically a dilemma that confronted the very poor, whose resources and networks of social support had both been exhausted. The point here is that however much bishops may have wished to do so, it was impossible to disentangle the external and internal supplies of enslaved labor in the late Roman world. In embracing a model of episcopal piety that centered on the liberation of captives, 5th century bishops quickly found that they could not just focus on cases where Christian Romans had been carried off into foreign slavery. They were forced to confront a far messier social reality, where widespread social practices, including self-sale, child sale, and the debt of labor that the redeemed owed to their liberators, had created a patchwork of circumstances in which the reduction of freeborn Romans to servitude was permissible even inside the territory of the empire. This in turn led to a certain amount of confusion in late Roman society about what legitimate enslavement looked like. This confusion is palpable in the questions that even as informed an observer as Augustine posed to an eminent lawyer about the practice of child sale. Under what conditions could a child be sold? For how long did a child's servitude last? Did both parents have the right to sell their children or just the father? Echoes of a similar confusion probably resonate in Theodosius's law against soldiers keeping liberated Roman captives as slaves. Confusion of this sort allowed an underground trade to flourish, in which Romans, many of whom were violently seized and carried off, were routinely and illicitly sold into bondage inside the empire, but outside of their home localities. Critically, their removal from their local context had the effect of separating the illicitly enslaved from their social networks of family, friends, and patrons, and transporting them to a distant place where nobody knew them, where they may very well not have spoken the local language, and thus where there was nothing and nobody that could testify to their free status. Inhabitants of the imperial borderlands in general, and of rural North Africa and the Balkans in particular, may have been especially vulnerable to illegal enslavement of this sort, because these regions were well known as important sources of legitimate slaves in late antiquity. And so to Romans elsewhere, there would have been nothing unusual about finding people from these places for sale on local slave markets. But in a world where bishops were claiming that they alone could ensure justice amidst the morass of calumny, the maintenance of episcopal authority and prestige required effective action. In his letter to Alypius, Augustine suggests that when his congregants presented him with 120 liberated captives upon his return to Hippo, he interviewed these unfortunates, as well as other witnesses who could testify to the circumstances surrounding their enslavement. Somewhat at a loss as to the legal basis on which he could act, the bishop invoked a law of Honorius forbidding the shipment of enslaved people overseas, but he was leery of subjecting the slave merchants to the punishment mandated by law, lashing with a lead-tipped whip, which was tantamount to a death sentence. Sidonius similarly seems to have investigated the accusation that his negotiator had purchased an illicitly enslaved woman. He examined Clermont's market register for the record of the sale, and he also appears to have inquired quite closely into the testimony of her kinsman. Theodoret similarly seems to have held an inquest of some sort, or at least he uses legalistic language to indicate both that Maria declared herself to be the daughter of the aristocrat Eudaimon and that others bore witness to the same fact. Even after they'd sifted through the evidence and reached their decisions, though, Augustine, Theodoret, and Sidonius all found themselves facing ongoing complications. As a result, each also found himself compelled to call upon networks of episcopal support that crossed provinces, regions, and even the empire itself. Sidonius wanted Lupus of Troyes to arbitrate between the family of the kidnapped woman and a certain Prudens, who had served as the guarantor of her sale, but who had subsequently left the Auvergne for Champagne. In Cyrus, Maria learned that her father had safely escaped Africa and secured an office for himself somewhere in the West. She was determined to find him, and Theodoret asked his fellow bishop Eustathius of Aigés to help her along the way. The great number of captives freed in Hippo necessitated their temporary placement with otherwise unidentified members of Augustine's congregation. Augustine was anxiously aware that these hosts were being pestered by the wealthy and highly placed slave merchants' patrons for the return of what they still regarded as their property. And so the bishop entreated Alypius, then at the Western Imperial Court, to intercede with the emperor to provide a firm and lasting resolution to the problem. In the pursuit of these objectives, all three bishops seem to have anticipated a certain amount of reluctance on the part of their correspondents, all of whom were also bishops, to mire themselves in the murky obscurities that surrounded the illicitly enslaved. In seeking to overcome this reluctance, Augustine, Theodoret, and Sidonius made an interlocking series of emotional appeals to what they assumed or hoped would be a set of values that the recipients of their letters shared. Strikingly, none of their arguments were theological in nature, nor were the values that they invoked even distinctively Christian. Like the act of liberating captives itself, they were instead widespread values with deep roots in Mediterranean society in general. One of the strongest of these appeals played on the recipient's sense of masculine honor by emphasizing female vulnerability. To some extent, of course, the fact that Theodoret and Sidonius's letters concerned captive women is a product of the caprices of source survival, for freeborn men and boys could clearly find themselves enslaved in the late Roman world too. By contrast, Augustine made a conscious choice to emphasize female captives. In his letter to Alypius, he was explicit that provincials of both sexes were being illegally carried off and enslaved in Africa. But when it came to discussing individual cases, he cited only a single male example, that of a monk who was seduced away from Augustine's own monastery and sold. The bishops Other more or less concrete examples were all female. The Numidian peasant girl snatched from her family during a night raid, country women from the region of Jidaba who were abducted and sold while selling wood in Hippo, the wife of a colonist who was hawked by her own husband. Unspoken, but certainly understood by author and reader alike, was the sexual humiliation and abuse to which women and girls who found themselves for sale on the slave markets of the late Roman world were routinely subjected. Christian bishops didn't dwell on the fate of female captives inside the empire, but they consistently projected their fears of the sexual mistreatment of women onto foreigners. Lots of examples of this, but to cite only two that are particularly relevant, Ambrose spoke in the same breath of redeeming captives and delivering women from shame. In the bishop's mind, the barbarian impurities to which women might be subjected were worse than death. And when put to good use, the gold of liturgical vessels could redeem not only the bodies of captives, but their sexual honor too. Augustine was similarly troubled by the sexual violence to which Roman women might be subjected in captivity, and conceded that it would be inhumane to condemn virgins either for committing suicide in order to avoid rape, or for submitting to physical violation in order to avoid committing suicide. Given its openly sexual charge, the enslavement of women encroached deeply on late Roman notions of male honor. It had a strong emotive impact, and it could serve as an effective spur to action. Other themes also thread through the three bishops' letters. One was violence, the violence to which the enslaved individuals had been subjected, which unsettled the imperial social order. The woman sold in Clermont had been attacked and carried off. The misfortune in which Maria lost her freedom certainly also involved force. Most of the 120 captives held in Hippo had been illegally abducted, some of them in military-style raids on rural African settlements by professional slave catchers dressed in the getup of soldiers and barbarians. Another common theme is the freeborn status of the captives, which granted them a kind of honor that was denied to those whom Augustine characterized as real slaves, vere servi. Family and its rupture is another of the common themes. Theodoret of Cyrus conjured this, the guardianship of family relationships, with particular skill in his letter to Eustathius of Aiga. The work is virtually a novel in miniature, and the story, which Theodoret deemed worthy of a tragedian, tells of Maria's capture, her descent into slavery, her liberation, and the discovery of her father's survival. After asking Eustathius to try to arrange passage for the girl, the Bishop of Cyrus assured his episcopal colleague that they shall certainly reap abundant rewards, who beyond all human hope bring the child to her father. The themes of family, freedom, violence, gender, honor, and the rights of citizens combine and recombine in these letters in such a way as to throw into sharp relief the concerns of an ecclesiastical elite still articulating their role in a society that was itself in the midst of dramatic change. So where does this all get us? The involvement of bishops in the liberation of captives was not new in the 4th century. Christians, like other members of Mediterranean society, had a long tradition of charitable giving for this purpose, and as leading members of their communities, bishops had for centuries collected the targeted donations of their congregants, and they had ensured that these offerings did their intended work in the world. In the context of the Roman Gothic Wars of 376 to 382, however, Ambrose radicalized episcopal practice in this regard, taking a far more active role in the liberation of captives, audaciously sacrificing liturgical vessels for this purpose, and in the process, dramatically signaling his commitment to saving ordinary Christians, not just in a spiritual and metaphysical sense, but in a concrete and worldly one as well. Directly or indirectly, Ambrose's new model of the bishop as liberator inspired a handful of his mostly younger contemporaries, including Martin of Tours, John Chrysostom, Paulinus of Nola, and Augustine of Hippo, and thus helped to shape an emerging ethos among the next generation of episcopal leaders in both East and West. In Ambrose's bold action, these bishops saw a template for navigating the acute reputational challenges that confronted them in their own political and sectarian contexts. The appeal of these radical tactics was most acute along or near the imperial borderlands, and it intensified over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, particularly in the West, as the strength of the empire crumbled and the frontier zone collapsed in upon itself. In the 6th century, the approach was validated in Roman law and broadened into something like a routine expectation of episcopal office. That broadening was the result of a dialogic relationship with the empire's ordinary inhabitants. Whatever their own relationship with the practice throughout late antiquity, bishops continued to insist, excuse me, to their congregants on the importance of making offerings for the redemption of captives. In return, those who spoke or acted up on behalf of Roman provincials who'd been carried off into captivity insisted that bishops follow through on their rhetoric and take an active hand in caring for those unfortunates when the opportunity presented itself. In most instances, it was doubtless the families, not the bishops of the enslaved, who served as their primary advocates. But ransoming captives was expensive, far beyond the modest means of most of the empire's inhabitants, and a range of others could get involved too. This included friends, neighbors, patrons, town councils, even imperial soldiers. But a greater or lesser degree of official complicity in the illicit sourcing of enslaved labor inside the empire through the kidnapping and overseas sale of imperial subjects made representatives of the Roman state protectors of, at best, dubious reliability. With few other viable options, the families and other advocates of the enslaved turned to bishops for aid, hoping that, like Ambrose, John, and Augustine, they would devote themselves to the care of the oppressed. Though a degree of confusion about the nature of legitimate slavery in the late Roman world could make bishops cautious, even reluctant to get involved, when their hands were forced, they were able to reach out to episcopal colleagues, appealing to their sense of duty and of masculine honor in an effort to get them to act too. For modern scholars, the episcopal commitment to the liberation of captives has become something of an unremarkable, even a timeless phenomenon. Examining it in closer detail, however, I hope I've shown that in its origins, even this practice was specific to the circumstances of the late 4th and 5th century Roman Empire, and that it was a product of a complex set of negotiations between the interests of bishops and those of ordinary imperial subjects who called upon them for support. As each of these parties sought to create and reinforce their bonds with the other, their actions raised big questions about what it was that precisely held the late antique world together. The imperial frame of rights, status, and law mattered here, but so did other ties, like a shared faith, family, and honor, to which the empire per se was largely incidental. By the end of the 5th century, it may not have been possible for an honorable bishop, it may not have been possible to be an honorable bishop and not concern oneself with the fate of captives. But as Roman control of the Mediterranean crumbled, the messy problem of defining where one's obligations began and ended came to be an increasingly urgent question, one that presented itself ever more forcefully to succeeding generations of episcopal leaders in the newly reconfigured world of the early Middle Ages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Conant, for such a wonderful talk. I have many questions. I'll just start with one, if that's okay, and then I'll open the discussion. You mentioned briefly the justification that the bishops gave for ransoming captives, and you mentioned that it wasn't really a spiritual, theological explanation. If I may, I want to push you slightly on this topic, because it seems to me that, especially Ambrose, when he was criticized for liquidizing and selling the vessels, he had to give a theological explanation, or he had to answer to this complaint somewhat spiritually. And how did he manage to answer this, especially in an environment that not all barbarians were pagans? So So the bad guys were Christian as well. And what happens if the people who were taken captive were not Christians, as you mentioned? So if I may just ask you to say a few words about that.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. Yes, Ambrose's justification of melting down church plate was theological, but it was his justification of melting down church plate, not his justification of liberating captives, right? The justification of liberating captives was kind of taken as given, right? That was a good thing to do. And probably especially because he's modeling himself on Cicero and kind of seeking to replace Cicero. And Cicero had also mentioned liberating captives is a good thing for someone to do, along with filling up. It's a good thing to do for a friend, right? Along with filling up the friend's daughter's dowry, and there are various other things that it's, just if you're an upstanding person, you should do. I think, Ambrose was fairly confident that no one was going to push him too much on the fact of liberating captives. Where he really had to cover his bases was precisely the melting down of the church plate. And there you're 100% right. That's a thoroughly theological justification. And just to elaborate slightly more, and then I'll stop. Klingshirn actually picks up on this point and points out that Cyprian, 100 years earlier, when Cyprian is gathering together this money for the liberation of captives, he does provide a theological justification. He cites biblical passages. He constructs a case, a specifically and distinctively Christian case for why freeing captives was a good thing to do as a Christian. But Ambrose doesn't do that. And Augustine and Sidonius and Theodoret, none of them do that either. In fact, Sidonius, I don't even think, I'm not sure how committed Sidonius is to the freeing of captives, other than that he praises his relative Claudius, who's a priest, for doing it. Sidonius's concerns are a little bit different. But Theodoret and Augustine, neither one of them invokes particularly Christian justifications for doing this.
Amazing, thank you. Now we have a question from Deborah Delianes.
Wait, I can't start my video. Can I start my video? I can ask it out. It won't. That's fine. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic.
Start your video now. Sorry,
yeah.
Deb.
I don't know. It says I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Can you try again? Wait. Yes.
There we go. There it is.
Deborah.
Hello. Thanks. I love it. And I especially love the context that you gave for the whole question of slavery and captivity in this 4th and 5th century. I had one comment about this because I've been working on this from the other side, which is the thing that Ambrose and everyone else is saying the money should be used for instead of. And implied in what Cicero does, I keep saying Cicero, and what Ambrose does is a rebuke to the people who want to give all this gold and silver plate to churches. And so since I'm writing this book about the development of fancy church ideology, right? Ambrose and all the rest of them are the other side of it, who say, no, we shouldn't have all this gold and silver in the church. We should be spending it on worthy things like ransoming captives, as Cicero says. And so I've been looking at this from the point of view of the context of this is the context of barbarian invasions and taking captives, but it's also the context of post-Constantinian church building, and the fact that there are all these very large basilicas that are now becoming stuffed with gold and silver, which Jerome especially, but Ambrose and Augustine in a certain way don't like. And Jerome, of course, is the one who argues against it and says it should be spent on the poor. Ambrose and Augustine don't go that far, but the whole thing about the captives is basically saying, no, we shouldn't have all this treasure in the church. We should be using it for a worthy purpose, casting around and saying, what's the worthy purpose? Oh, we should ransom captives. So I wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's absolutely right. I think, as I was writing this version of this talk, I kept casting my mind back also to Peter Brown's book on, giving to the church, and I mean that whole conversation that you and Peter are having about the church and wealth is absolutely threaded through this, and there's all sorts of comfort and discomfort with church wealth and what church wealth is actually for. It's a super important aspect. I completely agree with you. I'll see if I can find a way of working that more actively into the final version, but thank you. No, that's super helpful.
Our next question is from Aaron Thomas Daly.
Hi. Yeah, thanks so much for that talk, and well done not being interrupted by the plumber. I think you got away.
I'm impressed by him.
Yeah, he's silently working. Yeah. No, I wanted to ask a question that may not even have an answer, but I'm curious, if you're liberated through church plate, is that the same experience as being liberated through funding from a different source, or do you have these obligations now, like serving the church or serving the community or something like that?
That's another great question. And one of the paragraphs that didn't make the cut in terms of timing was a paragraph precisely on this. In fact, in De Officiis, Ambrose mentions two criticisms that are leveled at him. One is melting down the church plate, but the other one is that he didn't demand labor from the people that he liberated. He doesn't really say what he did. He's very elusive. There's two passages in De Officiis where he talks about this. Neither one of them give us a lot of detail about what he did. Mostly they're focused on justifications for liberating captives or justifications for melting down church plate. But he does say that unnamed people were upset that he didn't demand anything in exchange for liberating these people. And I think that's got to be a reference to this custom, not yet a law in his day, but this custom that you had to pay back your purchase price or you had to give 5 years of labor. And again, really reading between the lines, he talks about, the virtue. He hits heavily, the fact that it's virtuous to reunite families and to return people to their patria. So I think the kind of assumption has to be that Ambrose uses this plate, gets it to liberate people, and then sends these people back home more or less immediately. I mean, as soon as he can. So that would suggest, sorry, to return it to your actual question, that would suggest that the expectation, at least in the late 4th century, the expectation was that you owed the same debt to the church as you would to a private individual or a corporation who freed you. But I don't think there's not a super, like there's no exception to the law. So I think we sort of assume that debt is still there. How it's discharged or whether the bishop chooses to insist on it being discharged at all is another question.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Our next question from Shaha.
Thank you very much for this extremely stimulating talk. I have about 1 million questions, but I'll ask just one. I would like you to comment, if you can, on the connection between the developing legal reality and the spreading of Christianity, especially in light of cases, let's say, such as the one we can find with Gregory the Great. He has a letter that talks about Christian slaves that were bought in Gaul in a purchase that was endorsed by judges of the Republic. And the person who complains about this whole thing, they were purchased by Jews, by Jewish slavers. That's even worse. And the person who complains about it is the Bishop of Naples. And Gregory the Great's answer to it is, sure, I'll take care of it, but stay in your lane. We'll make sure that the slavers have 40 days to sell on their slaves. It wasn't on purpose. We don't want to make anybody lose too much money and so on. So I would like to hear your comment on that.
Yeah.
Do they reflect different approaches when it comes to the ransoming of captives, Gregory the Great and the Bishop of Naples?
Yeah. In all honesty, I haven't pursued the question as thoroughly into the 6th century or early 7th century as I would like. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a super satisfactory answer to your question. It's a good question and it's an important question, but it's not one that I think you've probably thought about this question more than I have. I think by the 6th century, the facts on the ground had just changed in the sense that, the empire is collapsing in the West over the course of the 5th century, but every one of these, authors who I'm talking about were clearly in the empire. Even Sidonius, I mean, it's really like the crickets are chirping on Roman Gaul, but even Sidonius is in the Roman Empire at this point, and Augustine definitely is, and Sidonius definitely is, and Ambrose and so forth. So by the late 6th, early 7th century, that situation had changed because you've got these new polities which are established and which have their own law, which is obviously related to Roman law, but which is also not Roman law. They've got their own rulers who have this weird relationship with the Roman Empire, but are clearly not just flunkies of the Roman state. Clovis, for example, we've got a letter from Clovis where he's like, really? Liberation of captives? What are you doing here? Are these real captives? Are they really, subject? He's already, beginning to express, and this is an early 6th century letter, he's already beginning to express skepticism about the claims that bishops are making. Oh, I had to melt down this church, plate because of captives. So I think there's a distinctive kind of 4th, 5th century moment where social reality is in big flux, and people who've been confronting this kind of internal market suddenly find bishops, partly because the status of the empire is in flux. Bishops have found religion, as it were, about liberating captives, and people latch onto that and they go with it as much as they can. By the 6th century, there's just so many captives everywhere, right? There's like the whole Western Mediterranean is a potential market for captives, and what your obligations to them are legally, morally, religiously, that gets so much muddier in the 6th century. There just aren't really clear lines. I mean, there are some very clear lines, but there are very, very few very clear lines. And my suspicion is that muddiness is kind of playing itself out in the different attitudes of Gregory and the Bishop of Naples there. And as you say, once you add Jews into the equation, kind of all bets are off, right? Because Christian bishops like to complain about Jews. Yeah, that's a kind of a hot take. Like I say, I don't think that's a super satisfying answer, but I would be delighted to keep talking about it with you more.
I would love that. Thank you very much.
Our next question is from Donato Citaro.
Can you see me? Thank you, Professor Conant, for the brilliant exposition talk, most of all for the wide topic that you faced. My question regards a case that perhaps falls into the realm of the two famous to be ever mentioned, the story of Patrick and Coroticus. he casts in his epistola the ransoming of captives as something shameful if compared mostly to the consuetude of the Gallo-Roman bishop to ransom captives at the hands of the Franks and other barbarians. He makes this comparison, and I'd argue that he sets this kind of comparison with the Gallo-Roman bishops in order to underline a different practice, indeed a different kind of ethos of Gallo-Roman bishops. And I wonder if this patrician mention sheds light on a wider lack of bishops' involvement in the insular context, where maybe Augustinian and Ambrosian directives about ransoming captives didn't take root in mid-5th century, and how these episodes reveal about Patrick's complaint about British clergy, and how much it says about the role of Gaulish bishops as a leading famous 5th century captive ransomers, about this kind of point of view.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think you've kind of answered your own question. I think it does. I think everything you just said is right. Yeah, Patrick is definitely one of these sources that I need to fold into this discussion a little bit more actively. And I think you're exactly right, that there are certain lines along which I think you can trace, well, as I tried to do in the talk, I think you can trace pretty clearly the lines along which this ethos of liberating captives spread. In the West, mostly it's Ambrose's circle. The East is a little bit less clear, but it's also a lot less common in the East. But I think you get John Chrysostom is probably indirectly influenced by Ambrose, and then Acacius is influenced by John and probably Cyril of Jerusalem and other people there. In the West, it spreads pretty clearly through Ambrose's circle. It starts out with Ambrose, and then people who know Ambrose, and then people like Augustine who explicitly model themselves on Ambrose, and then people who pick up Augustine and model themselves on Augustine or think Augustine is cool, and then people who think Paulinus of Nola is cool, and then slowly, as Augustine kind of hijacks theology in the Western Mediterranean, suddenly everyone is committed to liberating captives. But in the period before Augustine had taken over the West, you have fairly, I think, circumscribed networks along which this ethos disseminates. And I think you're right that Britain is mostly outside of those networks, and that's part of, as you said. I mean, again, I'm just kind of at this point, I'm just repeating what you've said. That this is precisely why Patrick draws that contrast between British practice and Gallo-Roman practice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we have a question from Merle Eisenberg.
Hey, Jonathan, good to see you.
Hey, Merle, good to see you too.
So I'm also going to ask you an unfair question about the endpoints of this, and you're going to tell me you don't want to do it, and that's fine. But you did hint at it in the talk, so I feel like it's justified, which I'm curious about differences. Sorry, there's small children yelling in the background. Differences between East and West here. And you mentioned in the East, right, this gets codified, I presume this is in the Justinianic Code in some form or another. In the West, the codification I can think of is Stephan Ester's recent work about the patronage, right, that they remain within the church. So I wonder, do you see some of this as being built into the economic fiscal system of churches in East and West in different ways as they divide how they're built into the landholding system into the 6th and 7th century, so that eventually in the West, right, the churches accumulate more property, and this becomes one way in which freed people stay under the property of the church, versus the East, it looks a little different. As you just said, there seems to be fewer examples of this.
Yeah, so I'm going to say probably. Yeah, probably. I had more to say than that, but what was I what was I going to say? Semester is the landowning. Right. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, one thing is it does actually also show up in Frankish canon law. So it's not exclusively the Justinianic Code. It is the Justinianic Code, but it's not exclusively the Justinianic Code. It's also Frankish canon law. I don't remember specifically where in Frankish canon law, but there are people in this Zoom room who are far more expert on Frankish canon law than I am, and they might be able to answer that question. But it does also show up in the West. And I mean, so are you suggesting that basically one of the things that Western churches are doing in acquiring land and becoming major landowners is they're building in a kind of contingency, like they're building in contingency holdings. So like we're going to buy this vineyard for when we need to sell church plate and liberate captives?
No, I mean, it was just more of a thought, right? From Klingshirn's argument about, you know, that it builds up power over time and patronage in the remainder of the church, that eventually, if you, in the Visigothic canons, and I guess Toledo 4, right, people who remain under the patronage of the church essentially can never be not under the patronage of the church. So it becomes a way in which you build an entire economic model.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, again, I'm going to kind of, as you said, I'm going to say I don't want to talk about that. But I think the 6th century changes things, right? Things are different. And I mean, much as I love Bill Klingshirn's article, and I think it's a fantastic article, and I think the broad point, all of the broad points that he makes are just as true of the 4th century as they are of the 6th century. A lot of the details change between the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries. So that I think, you know, in response to Aaron's question earlier, you know, do you continue to owe the church service if you're liberated by the church? In Ambrose's case, I think the answer is no. In Caesarius's case, I think the answer is yes. And, you know, as this practice kind of proliferates in Francia and in, you know, Hispania and places like that, I suspect that people did find themselves basically in a situation where you can be the slave of a Burgundian, or you can be, you know, an unfree laborer tied forever to the Church of Arles, right? So if I understand your question, then yes, I absolutely think that this is probably, but in the 6th century and later, I think this is probably part of an economic strategy that's pursued by bishops locally. But again, kind of a hot take.
We have a few more minutes if people are interested to ask more questions. All right, so please join me again in thanking Professor Johnathan Conant for his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Of course. So at the end of this lecture series, we wish to thank all of our speakers for this semester, Professor Raymond Van Dam, Professor Stefan Estes, Professor Micah de Jong, and Professor Johnathan Conant for agreeing to present the work and contribute to this lecture series. We also wish to thank Professor Itzik Chen, the head of the Israeli Institute for Advanced Study, for his unconditional support, and Dr. Tamar Rothman for her behind-the-scenes assistance. Lastly, we want to thank you, the audience and participants, for attending the talks and contributing to the Q&A. We encourage you to follow us on Facebook and YouTube, where you will receive updates on the forum's future activities. We will circulate the plan for the fall semester of 2022-2023 at the end of the summer, and we can already reveal that we will open the series with a talk by Professor Andrew Kane of the University of Colorado. On behalf of Shachar and myself, thank you. We wish you a wonderful and productive summer, and we hope to see you again in the fall. Thank you all.
Thanks.